Welcome to the Growth Mindset Center YouTube. Please take a moment of your precious time and generosity to click the subscribe button. Comment. Thank you very much. Please listen to the next great content. Ever wondered why some succeed silently while others shout but never grow? This will explain why. There's a deeper reason you're stuck, and it's not what you've been told. These insights will change how you act. When you stop waiting for motivation and start building momentum, everything transforms. Let's uncover how. There's no version of life that doesn't include setbacks. No matter how well you plan, how disciplined you are, how much you want it, This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional, will be resistance. There will be moments when it feels like everything you built is falling apart, when the thing you thought was certain disappears, when the people you trusted vanish, when the doors you were walking through close, without warning. And in those moments, you have a choice. You can collapse. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. Or you can come back stronger. Setbacks are not the end. They're invitations. They're turning points. They're opportunities to rebuild with more wisdom, more clarity, more force. But most people don't see them that way. Most people let the pain stop the progress. They let the failure define their identity. They confuse rejection with reality. And instead of rising, they freeze. They fold. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. They settle. But that doesn't have to be your story. You can train yourself to respond differently, to stand in the rubble and start rebuilding, to reframe the loss, to extract the lesson, to refocus your energy. And when you do that, when you respond with power, you become a different kind of person. You become unshakable. Not because you're immune to struggle, but because you. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Refuse to stay down. The most resilient people are not the ones who never get hit. They're the ones who always get back up. They don't avoid the breakdown. They rise through it. They use it. They let it shape them, sharpen them, stretch them, and on the other side, they're not just recovered, they're transformed. They didn't. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. Return to who they were. They became someone new. Every comeback begins with a decision. A decision to stop replaying what went wrong, and start choosing what to do next. A decision to stop giving your power to the problem and start using it to rebuild. A decision to stop asking why me and start asking what now, because setbacks don't kill progress. A lack. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Of response does. And the only thing worse than failing is staying stuck in the story about your failure. At some point, you have to stop waiting for someone to give you permission to move forward. You have to stop needing the apology, the explanation, the perfect plan. You have to choose strength. You have to choose movement. You have to choose the comeback. That decision isn't loud. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, isn't flashy. It's not made in front of a crowd. It's quiet. It's internal. It happens in the dark, in the silence, in the moment when you've had enough of being defined by defeat. And once you make it, really make it, you start moving differently. You stop carrying shame, you stop explaining, you stop performing for sympathy. You lock in. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Rise. You rebuild. Comebacks don't require perfection. They require persistence. They don't require a miracle. They require consistency. The most powerful stories you've ever heard didn't begin with victory. They began with collapse, with devastation, with loss. But the hero in that story, they didn't stop there. They kept going. And because they kept going, the story changed. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Setback isn't who you are. It's just a moment, a chapter, a challenge. It doesn't get to write the ending unless you let it. You get to decide what happens next. And when you know how to take that pain, that loss, that rejection, and use it to fuel your evolution, nothing can hold you back for long. The first strategy is to face. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The truth without fear. When setbacks hit, the natural instinct is to run, to avoid, to look away, to pretend it didn't happen, to shift blame, to minimize the loss, to numb the pain. But you cannot change what you're not willing to confront. And the truth, even when it hurts, is always the starting point of a real comeback. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. There's no transformation without honesty, no rebound without reality, no clarity without confrontation. You have to face the situation head-on, not with panic, but with presence. You have to strip the story back to what actually happened. What did I do? What did I allow? What pattern repeated? What decision led me here? Not. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. To shame yourself, but to find the facts. Because clarity is power. Most people get stuck not because the problem is too big, but because their ego is too loud. They'd rather protect their pride than rebuild their life. They want to be right more than they want to be free. But you can't grow through a setback if your identity is attached. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional to the version of you that caused it. You have to be willing to evolve, and that begins with truth. You take a deep breath, you sit down, you say, "This is what happened." No more excuses. No more denial. No more distractions. This is where I am. This is what I lost. This is what I allowed. This is what I avoided. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. What I need to learn. And that moment of honesty, that's the pivot point. That's the shift. That's where healing begins. You will never heal in what you're still hiding from. You can't move forward while dragging lies behind you. The truth might sting, but lies rot. They poison your progress. They delay your comeback. They keep you stuck in shame when... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You should be building something new. When you tell the truth, you cut through confusion. You silence the noise. You reclaim your power. You stop looking for someone else to fix it. You stop performing for sympathy. You stop begging for a redo. You start designing your response. You take the pen back. You take your voice back. You take your future back. And this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. This kind of truth isn't about reliving the pain. It's about removing the weight. Because when you tell the truth, you take the emotional charge out of the setback. You see it clearly. You stop dramatizing it. You stop defining yourself by it. You stop being the victim and start being the architect. You stop needing people to agree with your version of the story. When you're honest with yourself, you don't This is where the real shift begins when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, need validation from anyone else. You don't need to argue your point. You don't need to convince someone else to see it your way, because truth gives you peace, and peace lets you move. And here's the power of truth. It's where forgiveness lives. You can't forgive yourself for what you won't admit. You can't forgive others for what you keep bearing. But once you see it clearly, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You can say, "This happened. I own it. I release it. I'm done carrying it." And from that place, you can begin again. It doesn't mean it didn't matter. It doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It means it no longer holds your power. You've acknowledged it. You've faced it. And now you're using it. Using the lesson, using the pain, using the insight to be. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Rebuild better, stronger, cleaner, clearer. There is nothing more courageous than telling yourself the truth, because it means you're done pretending, done performing, done defending what broke you, and now you're available for the real breakthrough. Because real healing only happens in truth. Real clarity only shows up in truth. Real freedom begins the moment you say, "This is where I am, and I'm ready to rise." This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Second strategy is to separate your failure from your identity. Because the setback is something you went through. It is not who you are. You lost a job. You didn't lose your value. You made a mistake, but you're not a mistake. You fell short, but you're not broken. Your setback happened to you, but it does not define you unless you let it. Most people. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Never come back. Not because they're incapable, but because they internalize the fall. They personalize the failure. They wrap their identity around the pain and start believing, "This is who I am now." But you're not what happened to you. You're what you decide to do next. And that decision starts when you stop labeling yourself based on a season. Failure is. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. An event. It's not a personality trait. It's not a permanent title. It's an experience, and a useful one, if you allow it to teach you instead of bury you. Every person you admire has failed more than they've succeeded. The difference is they didn't stop at failure. They didn't let one moment become their identity. You can't heal. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, if you're still calling yourself names. You can't grow if you're still carrying shame. You can't create a comeback if you're dragging the belief that you're not worthy of one. At some point, you have to separate what happened from who you are. You have to stop saying, "I'm not good enough," and start saying that didn't work. But this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. I will. This is the moment where self-compassion meets strength, where you stop punishing yourself and start parenting yourself. You speak to yourself with honesty, yes, but also with respect. You say, "I didn't get it right, but I'm learning, I'm growing, and I am not staying here." That voice, that energy, that's the beginning of transformation, because identity drives behavior. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. See yourself as stuck, you will act stuck. If you see yourself as a failure, you will repeat failure. But if you shift the identity even before the results shift, your actions will follow. You'll walk like someone who's building again. You'll move like someone who's rising. You'll show up like someone who still believes in what they carry. One of the most important questions you can ask after a setback is, this is where the real shift begins when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Who do I believe I am right now? Not what did I do, not what did I lose, but who am I choosing to become in the middle of this? Because your comeback won't be powered by your resume. It will be powered by your identity, by the story you decide to tell yourself when everything feels uncertain. This doesn't mean you ignore what happened. It means this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. You stop letting it own you. You extract the lesson without absorbing the lie. You rebuild your confidence from the inside out, not by pretending, but by choosing. Choosing to define yourself by your potential, not your past. And it's not one choice, it's daily. You will feel the pull to shrink. You will feel the weight. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional of doubt. You will hear the old stories rise up. But every time you remind yourself, I am not what I went through. I am not what I lost. I am not the worst thing that happened to me. You take your power back. You anchor your identity in truth. You become someone who rises not because you have to. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, but because that's who you are. That's what you do. You've stopped tying your worth to a result. You've started tying it to your resilience, your character, your decision to grow. That identity, anchored in strength, not in shame, is what will carry you through. The third strategy is to reconnect with your reason. When life hits hard, when the plan falls apart, when this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The loss knocks the air out of your lungs when the thing you trusted crumbles. It's easy to lose your why, to disconnect from your mission, to forget what you were fighting for. And without a reason to rise, staying down starts to make sense. You don't need more motivation. You need meaning. You need a reason deeper than the resistance. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Reason bigger than the pain. A reason that speaks louder than the fear. Because setbacks scream. They scream doubt, shame, confusion, and unless your why is louder, you'll believe them. Your comeback begins the moment your purpose becomes non-negotiable. When you decide, I don't care how heavy this feels, I'm not done. When you say, this season won't end, this is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Me, because what I'm building matters too much to quit. Now, that's when the energy returns. That's when the spark reignites. Not from outside inspiration, but from deep internal alignment. Most people stay stuck, not because they can't move, but because they've lost sight of why it matters. They're disconnected from the deeper reason, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Thing they were building for, the legacy they were protecting, the version of themselves they were becoming. When the vision fades, the fight does too. This is why your reason has to be personal, emotional. It can't be vague. It can't be borrowed. It has to be yours. You need a reason that grabs your heart. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. That brings tears to your eyes when you think about quitting. That makes comfort look like a threat, and mediocrity feel like betrayal. Maybe it's your kids. Maybe it's your name. Maybe it's your future self. Maybe it's the life you said you'd build and the version of you who's still waiting on you to show up. Whatever it is, write it down. Revisit it. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, often. Speak it out loud. Tattoo it on your mind. Because your reason is what holds you when everything else falls apart. When you're in the middle of the storm, logic won't save you. Numbers won't save you. You need emotion. You need fire. You need something that reminds you why you started and convinces you not to stop. Your reason will do that if this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You stay connected to it. Reconnect by remembering. Remember who you were before the pain. Remember the promises you made to yourself. Remember the vision you had when you still believed. And then ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be on the other side of this? Because your comeback is not just about recovering, it's about, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, becoming. When your reason is clear, you stop bargaining with discipline. You stop negotiating with growth. You stop needing comfort to move. You move because it matters, because it's personal, because you know what's on the line. Your reason brings focus. It keeps you from chasing distractions. It keeps you locked in when everything around you tries to pull you away. It gives you... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Something to aim at when life tries to bury you under a pile of noise. And it won't feel strong every day. That's normal. But when it fades, you revisit it. You remind yourself. You write it again. You speak it again. You refuse to let temporary discouragement erase long-term direction. Because when you have a reason, you don't need perfect circumstances. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Just need to remember who you are and what you're building. You just need to move imperfectly, inconsistently, painfully, but still move, because your why is stronger than the setback. The fourth strategy is to shift your language, because the words you speak about your situation are shaping your relationship with it. Every time you describe your life, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You reinforce it. Every time you tell the story of your setback, you either empower your future or re-energize your pain. Words are not just commentary, they are construction. They either build your comeback or keep you circling your breakdown. Most people don't realize how much damage their language is doing. They say things like, "I'm just stuck," or "nothing ever works out for me," or "this always happens." This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. And every time those words leave their mouth, their identity locks around the setback even tighter, because what you speak becomes what you believe, and what you believe becomes what you expect, and what you expect becomes what you live. If you want to recover, you need to speak from a different place. Not from fear, not from frustration, from truth, from vision, from the person you are becoming. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The person who got knocked down. You don't deny the pain, but you don't give it the microphone. You don't keep rehearsing the same story if it's keeping you small. Start noticing your language, not just around others, but especially when you're alone. The way you talk to yourself after you fall, the words you choose when describing your challenge are, This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. They words of defeat or direction? Are they rooted in shame or in strength? Are you talking like a victim or like someone who's already started to rise? Language has energy. It either drags you back or pulls you forward. So when you fall, don't say I'm a failure. Say that didn't work and now I'm adjusting. Don't say I don't know what. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional to do. Say I'm learning what to do. Don't say this broke me. Say this stretched me and I'm coming back stronger. This isn't about lying to yourself, it's about leading yourself. It's about telling the truth in a way that builds momentum instead of shame. Shame keeps you circling. Language rooted in growth moves you. It nudges you. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. It gives your nervous system something new to believe. You'll feel the difference immediately. The moment you change how you speak about what happened, your body responds differently. Your energy shifts. You breathe a little deeper. You move with a little more intention, because you're no longer reinforcing the narrative that you're helpless. You're rewriting it. And this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Get consistent with it. When you stop speaking death over your dreams and start speaking life into your potential, you'll notice that your mind begins to look for solutions instead of threats. Your eyes begin to see possibility instead of problems. People underestimate how much power their daily words have. They think breakthrough will come. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional from one big external event. But most breakthroughs come from the small daily internal decisions to stop rehearsing defeat and start declaring direction. You can't always change what happened, but you can always change how you talk about it, and that shift, though simple, is strategic. It will start to rewrite. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The way you see yourself, the way you approach problems, the way you hold your energy in the face of adversity. You've already survived what tried to break you. Now you need to stop repeating it like it still defines you. Stop describing your life like nothing can change. Stop telling stories that keep you in the past. Start. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Speaking like someone who is healing, like someone who is rebuilding, like someone who knows they're not done yet. The fifth strategy is to rebuild momentum with small, decisive wins. When you're coming out of a setback, the biggest lie is that you have to do something big right away, that you have to fix everything overnight. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. To have to come back with fireworks. But comebacks don't begin with breakthroughs. They begin with basics, small steps, clear actions, tiny wins that remind your mind, I'm moving again. When you fall, your confidence takes a hit. Your belief starts to fracture. Your identity feels shaken. And if you try to leap too far, too fast, you'll overwhelm yourself. You'll freeze. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Talk yourself out of it, because your nervous system can't make that jump all at once. It needs evidence. It needs movement. It needs the rhythm of small victories stacked over time. Start small. Pick something you can control today, something you've been avoiding, something that speaks to progress, not perfection. It might be making one phone call, writing, this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. one paragraph, taking a walk, cleaning one drawer, finishing the task you left undone. It doesn't have to be impressive. It has to be intentional. Because every time you follow through on a small win, you rebuild trust with yourself. You prove to your mind that you're no longer stuck. You remind. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Your body, what forward feels like. You reinforce the identity of someone who moves, who acts, who doesn't let resistance decide the day. Momentum isn't magic. It's momentum. Once you take one step, the next one is easier. Once you complete one task, your focus sharpens. Once you move, inertia starts working for you instead of against you. But this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You don't wait for it, you build it. People stay down not because they don't care, but because they overthink the comeback. They make it too complicated, too heavy, too far away. So they wait, they delay, they think, when I'm ready, I'll start. But readiness is a byproduct of action, not a prerequisite. You don't wait to feel ready. You move until. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You are. And when you move consistently, when you stack small wins, you start to feel the shift. You start to walk differently, speak differently, think differently, because momentum changes your perspective. It makes what felt impossible last week feel manageable today. It makes your comeback feel real, not theoretical. Stacking small wins rewires your brain. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, mind learns through repetition. It learns through followeth through. So every time you finish what you start, your brain makes a note. I can trust myself. And that trust, that's the foundation of resilience. You don't need to prove anything to anyone else right now. You just need to start proving it to yourself. Proving. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. That you're not the setback. That you're not frozen in time. That you're capable of moving forward even if the pace is slow. And don't confuse small with insignificant. One small decision can change the direction of an entire season. One tiny act of courage can unlock a flood of clarity. Don't underestimate what can happen when. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You just begin. The sixth strategy is to protect your energy like your future depends on it, because it does. When you've been knocked down, your energy is vulnerable. You're sensitive to noise, drained by overthinking, tempted to respond to everything. But if you don't learn to guard your energy in the rebuild, you'll stay stuck longer. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional than necessary. You'll spend the energy you need for your comeback trying to manage opinions, regrets, and internal chaos. You only get so much energy in a day, and that energy has to be invested, not scattered. It has to be directed toward healing, toward building, toward clarity, not toward explaining yourself to people who won't understand. Not. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, toward reliving what went wrong, not toward replaying conversations that already ended. The fastest way to stay stuck is to give your attention to things that don't feed your next step. It might be a conversation that doesn't need to be had, a person you're still trying to convince, a battle you were never meant to fight. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Coming back, you need every ounce of energy focused forward. That means setting boundaries, not out of bitterness, out of stewardship. You don't allow everything into your space anymore. You don't engage every message, respond to every opinion, or carry every expectation. You don't have the margin. You're rebuilding, and that requires discipline. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Protect your inner environment. The words you say to yourself, the thoughts you allow to repeat, the tone you use when you talk about your life. Energy is not just physical. It's mental, emotional, spiritual. If you're drained all the time, it's not always because you're working too hard. It might be because you're thinking too. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, hard about things that don't matter. You train your energy by becoming selective. You stop living on default. You choose what enters your mind. You choose what leaves your mouth. You choose what conversations you allow, what media you consume, what stories you believe. And every time you make a decision that honors your future, your energy becomes stronger. And this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Truth. Some people won't like your new boundaries. Some people benefited from your exhaustion. They liked you when you were always available, always apologizing, always carrying the emotional weight of everyone around you. But when you start protecting your energy, some people will fall away. That's okay. Let them. Your future requires a new version of you, and not everyone will have a seat. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. At that table, you don't owe anyone access to your peace. You don't owe anyone your burnout. You don't have to explain why you're not answering every text or attending every event. Your comeback is sacred. Your rebuild is personal. And anyone who truly loves you will honor that process. You have to protect your physical energy. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Your body is the vessel that carries your comeback. If you're exhausted, undernourished, sleep-deprived, overstimulated, you won't have the capacity to move forward with strength. Take care of yourself. Rest. Eat well. Breathe deep. Move your body. These are not luxuries, they are necessities. This is not the season to run yourself into the ground. It's the season. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. To move with precision, to walk in your lane with focus, to cut the noise so you can hear your intuition again, to preserve your energy so you can pour it into the rebuild. And as you protect your energy, your confidence returns, your mind clears, your direction sharpens, because now you're no longer surviving off scraps. You're no longer depleted by everything. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional around you. You're filled, you're stable, you're ready to build something that lasts. The seventh strategy is to recommit to discipline even when motivation is gone, especially when it's gone. Because the comeback doesn't wait for your emotions to cooperate. It doesn't care if you feel inspired. It doesn't require that you wake up excited. It just requires that. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You keep going with focus, with integrity, with action, no matter what you feel. Setbacks have a way of draining motivation. They make everything feel heavier, slower, less certain. And that's when the temptation creeps in to let go of the habits, to stop showing up, to let discipline slip, because what's the point? But discipline is the point. Discipline. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, is how you hold the line while you rebuild. It's how you prove to yourself that the version of you who rises again is even stronger than the version who fell. Most people wait until they feel ready to take action again. But feelings follow focus, and focus follows action. You don't sit around hoping to feel better. You move, you train, you execute. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. You make one clear decision, and then you make the next one. That's how discipline becomes identity. Discipline is doing what needs to be done even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. It's putting your comeback on the calendar. It's getting up when it's easier to stay down. It's making the call, doing the rep, writing the plan, showing up for yourself, even. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. When no one's watching, and when you stack enough days like that, when you show up for your own future consistently enough, it becomes real. You stop hoping for a comeback. You start living it, not because everything's fixed, but because you've stopped waiting to feel perfect before you act. Discipline brings you back to center. It grounds you. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, gives you rhythm when life feels chaotic. You may not be able to control the storm, but you can control your habits inside the storm. You can choose your actions. You can own your effort. You can lead yourself with clarity even when nothing around you makes sense. This is why you keep your routines, even. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, when the results are slow. You keep your morning practices even when the breakthrough feels far away. You eat well. You move your body. You stay accountable. Not because it's flashy, but because it's who you are now. Your comeback is built on structure. It's built on repetition. You rebuild your confidence by following through. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Rebuild your stability by creating order. You rebuild your identity by choosing discipline over emotion again and again until it becomes your new default. Discipline is not about force. It's about alignment. It's the decision to keep acting like the person you said you'd become, even when you don't feel like that person yet. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. That behavior becomes belief. That repetition becomes resilience. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be consistent. You just need to show up. Even if you're crawling, even if it's messy, even if your best today doesn't look like your best yesterday, discipline is flexible like that. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. It meets you where you are. It carries you when motivation won't, and eventually it transforms you. Not just your habits, not just your outcomes. Your mindset, your posture, your standards, your ability to trust yourself in any season, because now you're not just hoping you'll make it. You know you will, because This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Disciplined enough to keep going. The 8th strategy is to use pain as a path, not a prison. Because the setback hurts. It knocks the air out of your chest. It leaves you confused, disoriented, grieving something you thought would last. Pain shows up fast. It doesn't ask for permission, and when it hits, you have 2 choices. Let it break you. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional, or let it shape you. Pain is a teacher, one of the most honest teachers you'll ever meet. It doesn't flatter, it doesn't sugarcoat, it tells you where you've been ignoring reality. It shows you what needs to be healed, it reveals where you've been settling, and it opens a door not to punishment, but to transformation. Most people try to escape. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Pain as fast as possible. They run to distraction, to denial, to busy work, to something, anything that keeps them from having to feel. But pain that is avoided gets stored. It hides in the background, and it keeps replaying itself in patterns and people and situations that feel different but end the same. You can't heal what you won't feel. You can't use This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. Pain, if you keep burying it. The power comes not from avoiding it, but from stepping into it with courage and asking, what is this pain here to teach me? That question changes everything, because pain always has a message. Maybe it's teaching you that you ignored your instincts, that you betrayed your boundaries, that you handed your power to something that... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Didn't deserve it, that you outgrew a situation long ago but stayed because it was familiar. Pain tells the truth, not to shame you, but to free you. And when you're willing to face it, not dramatize it, not drown in it, but face it, you find the lesson. You find the wisdom. You find the strength. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. I didn't know was there. And that strength becomes the foundation for the comeback. You stop seeing the setback as punishment and start seeing it as preparation, as redirection, as divine alignment. Because sometimes the door closes not to ruin you, but to rescue you. And sometimes the pain is the thing that gets your attention when nothing else could. When you use pain as a path, you stop asking, why did this happen to this? Is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, me. And start asking, what is this building in me? You stop reliving the moment it broke and start leaning into the version of you it's breaking open, the stronger, wiser, more grounded you that only comes through fire. Pain doesn't mean you failed. It means you felt. It means you tried. It means you were brave enough to care, brave enough to risk, brave enough to believe. And now, it's time to be brave. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, enough to rebuild. This doesn't mean rushing through it. It means not wasting it. It means sitting with the ache until the lesson emerges, until the emotion softens, until the fog lifts. It means trusting that even in this, especially in this, something meaningful can be born. Because some of your most powerful clarity will come from your deepest confusion. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Greatest growth will come from your greatest loss. And some of your most beautiful beginnings will start in the middle of your most painful endings. So don't let pain stop you. Let it teach you. Let it soften you without making you fragile. Let it strengthen you without making you hard. Let it shape you into someone who can hold the next season with more wisdom, more. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Gratitude, more resilience than ever before. The 9th strategy is to get crystal clear on who you're becoming. Because after a setback, the worst thing you can do is try to return to who you were. That version of you didn't survive the storm. You did. That version of you didn't know what you know now. Didn't carry what you now carry. The goal. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment, and momentum is no longer optional. Is not to go back. It's to evolve forward. To become someone new, someone deeper, someone stronger, someone with the wisdom that only failure, pain, and challenge can teach. You can't create a powerful comeback if your goal is to rewind. You need vision, not just to fix what broke, but to reimagine who you're becoming. Because people who don't know this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Their going tend to repeat where they've been. And if you're not intentional, you'll fall back into the same patterns, the same environments, the same limitations that created the setback in the first place. The question isn't just, how do I bounce back? It's, who am I becoming because of this? What habits need to die? What beliefs need to shift? What boundaries need to be? This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, built. What clarity have I gained that needs to guide me? Now, when you get clear on who you're becoming, decisions get easier. You stop negotiating with the old version of you. You stop taking advice from people who only know your past. You stop trying to convince people to understand a version of you they've never met. Because this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Version. It's not for everyone, it's for the life you're building now. You start saying no more. You start protecting your space more. You stop explaining and start executing. Not because you're arrogant, but because you're focused. Because you know exactly who you're becoming. And anything that doesn't align with that no longer fits. This is your chance to reset. Not. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Just your habits. Not just your schedule. Your identity. You get to rewrite the narrative. You get to stop being the person who used to and start being the person who now is. You get to release in the guilt, the shame, the need to carry every mistake like a permanent label. You don't heal by dragging the old story into the new chapter. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Heal by writing a new one. By speaking like the person you're becoming, acting like the person you're becoming, thinking like the person you're becoming, even before you fully feel like them. This version of you, they move with clarity. They don't wait for applause. They don't need permission. They know what matters. They've been through fire, and they carry the lessons. They don't waste time. They don't apologize. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional for growth. They show up with intention and protect what they're building. You build this version of you by making aligned decisions, not dramatic ones, not emotional ones, quiet, grounded, repeated decisions that reinforce your new identity. You make a plan. You create structure. You build rhythm. You say, "This is who I am now," and then you live like it. And on the days you don't feel like it, you act like it anyway. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, because you're not faking. You're forming. And the more you form, the more you believe. The more you believe, the more you act. The more you act, the faster the old identity fades, and one day it's gone. And you're not pretending anymore. You're just living the comeback. The 10th strategy is to finish the story, not the story that happened. The story This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Still writing. The story about what the setback meant, about what it did to you, about what it took from you or what it built inside you. Because every setback writes a first draft, but you get to write the ending. And until you do, it's not finished. Until you do, you're living in the middle. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional of a sentence that's still open. Most people don't realize they're still living inside a story that they didn't choose. Something painful happened. Something collapsed. Someone left. Something failed. And instead of writing their own interpretation of that moment, they accepted someone else's. Or, worse, they let silence finish the story for them. You know what's happening when... This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You hear yourself say, I guess I'm just not meant for that. Or, I'll never recover from this. Or, people like me don't win. That's not truth. That's a story. A story that was born in pain. A story that's begging to be edited, to be rewritten, to be finished with strength, not shame. You have to reclaim authorship of your life. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. You have to stop waiting for someone to rescue the narrative. You have to stop acting like the chapter is over just because you hit a difficult line. Setbacks are not conclusions. They're commas. They pause the momentum, but they don't erase the mission. Unless you stop writing, you are not finished. Your comeback is not a fantasy. It's a decision. You get to pick up the pen and say, yes. This is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, that happened. Yes, it hurt, but here's what happened next. And you write that next part through your choices, through your response, through your discipline, your healing, your courage to rise again. And it doesn't have to be loud. You don't need to prove it to anyone. You don't need to make a speech. You don't need to post about it. Just finish the story quietly, strongly. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, intentionally. Finish it by showing up again, by rebuilding, by growing, by healing. Your future is watching. Your future is waiting. And it doesn't care what happened back there. It cares about what you do from here. It cares about how you close the loop. About whether you let that chapter define you or whether you use it to deepen this is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Story of your strength. There is power in resolution, power in completion, power in standing over the ashes of what broke you and saying, I'm still here and I'm not just surviving. I'm writing something new. So decide. Decide to finish it. Decide to stop letting the pain be the last voice. Decide that you will rise, not by accident, but on purpose. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Not someday, today. Not when it's all fixed now. You already have everything you need. The comeback starts with you. Turning a setback into a comeback isn't just about what you do. It's about who you become in the process. It's not about bouncing back to the same place. It's about rising into something stronger, something wiser, something more complete. Because this is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. If you walk through fire and come out unchanged, you miss the lesson. You miss the power. And the power is this. You were never defined by the fall. You were defined by the rise. Every person who's ever inspired you, every leader you've ever looked up to, every story that ever moved you, it all had a setback in it. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional, a moment where it looked like the end, a moment when there was every reason to quit. And what made the story powerful wasn't the pain, it was the choice to keep going. That's what makes a comeback mean something. You don't need to get it all back. You don't need to recreate the past. You just need to take the next right step. And then, this is where the real shift begins. When thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Another, and then another. Because comeback stories are not written in one massive leap. They're written in daily decisions, to stay focused, to stay grounded, to stay committed to growth even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You're not the same person you were before the setback. And that's the point. You've seen some things now. You've lost some. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment. And momentum is no longer optional. Things. You've learned things the hard way. And that learning, that scar tissue, that weight you carried for longer than you should have, that's your fuel now. That's your wisdom now. That's your strength. It's easy to celebrate success. But what's far more powerful is learning how to celebrate recovery. Learning how to honor the quiet strength. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. It takes to get back up, to start again, to rebuild when no one's clapping and nothing's guaranteed. That is a sacred kind of power, a rare kind of resilience. And it's already inside you. So don't wait. Don't wait for perfect. Don't wait for proof. Don't wait for everything to be lined up. You already know what to do. You've already felt. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. The pull to begin again. You've already survived what was meant to stop you. Now it's your turn to rise. Not as a reaction, but as a declaration. This is who you are now. Not just someone who got through it. Someone who learned, who shifted, who grew, who leads themselves differently now, who moves with clarity now, who speaks with strength. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Now, who doesn't need the past to approve of the future they're building? You're not broken. You're becoming. You're not behind. You're being prepared. And you're not late. You're right on time to take control of your narrative, your energy, your focus, and your future. This is where the real shift begins, when thought becomes commitment and momentum is no longer optional. Setback is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And the rest, that's yours to write. Thank you for listening, and subscribe, comment on the channel.